I would like to welcome everyone. As director of vASN, I am delighted that we are featuring this important book, Yellow Star, Red Star by Jelena SubotiÄ on vASN. And before we begin the conversation, I'd like to say a few words about this new platform, vASN, that we created during the summer months to complement the activities of the ASN. And it's being developed as one of the three main pillars of the association. The other two are the association's annual convention, which is held at the Harriman Institute of Columbia University in New York, and the call for papers for the 2021 convention has been circulated and is posted on the ASN website. And of course, our journal, Nationalities Papers, which is a major, impactful, interdisciplinary journal in the field, and it's published by Cambridge University Press. So the scope of vASN is to serve as a year-round platform that provides opportunities for knowledge sharing and sharing of expertise about pressing issues of nationalism and ethnicity generally, and particularly in the regions that ASN has traditionally covered, Europe and Eurasia, opportunities for learning about professional development in this field, teaching, publishing, preparing for the job market within and outside the academia, doing research in difficult places, difficult times, and so on. And opportunities simply to come together and enjoy the benefit of being part of this community, of the support that ASN can provide. And this, wherever you are, if you belong to the global community that's committed to understanding nationalism and ethnicity, which are obviously hugely important subjects that are not going away. And if you're interested in how they are conceived, what theories are available, how they work, particularly in various parts of Europe and Eurasia, we are very happy to welcome you in the ASN community, and membership information is available on the website. So please join us, and I will now turn over the virtual floor to the moderator of this panel, Florian Bieber, who is also the president of the Association for the Study of Nationalities.
Thank you, Zsuzsa, for this introduction, and thank you all for joining. I'm very glad that we have over 140 participants in today's book discussion, and it's my great pleasure to moderate this panel on a book by Jelena SubotiÄ, Yellow Star, Red Star, Holocaust Remembrance After Communism. It is also, this is what it looks like if you haven't seen it yet, and it's no coincidence that this is the book we are discussing today. It's the winner of the Joseph Rothschild Prize in Nationalism and Ethnic Studies, which is awarded annually by the ASN in cooperation with the Harriman Institute. It's been over 10 years now that the ASN has been handing out this prize to contributions in the field. And also as a member of the jury, I'm very glad that we could select Jelena's book for the prize this year, as we all consider it to be an important contribution to scholarship. And normally at the convention, we would award the book prize winner the award, and we would also maybe have a panel there. But as we didn't have that opportunity, it's nice to at least in a certain way pay tribute and have an opportunity to discuss the book and congratulate Jelena this way, but also to have a conversation about the book and to find out a little bit more, not just what's in it, but also have a debate about what any good academic book should trigger. So I will not present the book here because this would be redundant, considering that Jelena SubotiÄ will present it herself. but I will present our panel today and tell you a little bit how we're going to do this. So Jelena Subotić is a professor at the Department of Political Science at Georgia State University. She's been writing on questions of memory politics, human rights, transitional justice. She's published more than a decade ago a very influential book called Hijacked Justice, which was dealing with the past, but not the past of World War II, as this book does, but with the past of the 1990s in the post-Yugoslav space. So she will be first to introduce the book, but we will then have comments by two panelists, Emil Kereni, who is the applied research scholar at the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, a researcher who's worked on many of the topics which Jelena is addressing as well, and he will be giving his comments. And then afterwards, we're joined by Jelena Đurenović, who is currently a postdoc at the University of Vienna, who completed her PhD at the University of Gießen. And she has also, I should mention, authored a book published recently called The Politics of Memory of the Second World War in Contemporary Serbia, which is a nice supplement and complement to what we are discussing today. For the audience, you are welcome to contribute in two ways. You can ask your questions in the Q&A option throughout, but it is something which I will ask them the questions to the panelists, in particular to Jelena Subotić, and also you have the chat function for further questions you might have. The way we're going to do this is Jelena will have a chance to present her book, and she will also introduce in a certain way the process in developing it. And then we will have Emil, who will come in with his comments, followed by Jelena. And then Jelena Subotić will be able to answer to those comments, and then we'll open up for a conversation. We have a bit more than an hour and 10 minutes, so I'm sure we'll have a lively conversation. And without further ado, I'm handing over to Jelena to give us an insight into her book and also what motivated her in writing this story. Jelena, the floor is yours, and I believe you also have a presentation you want to share with us.
Yes, and thank you very much, and thank you so much for all of you who have decided to attend another Zoom panel. I really appreciate the readers' interest, both in the book, but more broadly in the topic, which is much more important, obviously, than my book. So what I've prepared are a few images to just give you a sense, really, of the flow of the book and some of the motivating events that have brought me to write the book. I'm going to try and share my screen, and we're good. Excellent. So in 2014, I visited my hometown of Belgrade, Serbia, and I went to see an exhibition at the Serbian Historical Museum, which was called "In the Name of the People: Political Repression in Serbia After World War II." And this exhibition promised to display new historical documents and evidence of various communist crimes. And as I was walking through the exhibit, I stopped in my tracks because I recognized the photograph. It's the one on your left. So in the Belgrade exhibition, this image was displayed in the section devoted to the communist era camp for political prisoners on the Adriatic island of Goli Otok. And the exhibition in Belgrade describes this photograph as, quote, "the example of living conditions of Goli Otok prisoners," end quote. But of course I knew that the photograph was not it. In front of me was in fact the photograph that you see on the right, which is a very well-known photograph of prisoners from the Nazi Buchenwald concentration camp, including Elie Wiesel, who is, I can't point, but one of the inmates here. And this image was taken at Buchenwald Liberation in April 1945. It is in fact one of the most well-known photographs of the Holocaust. So I went home, I called a couple of historian friends who assured me that complaints had already been lodged with the museum and that the display was about to be corrected. Sometime thereafter, in response to an outcry from Holocaust historians, a small note indeed was taped underneath the display, and that caption read, quote, "a photograph of prisoner boxed beds in Dachau camp," end quote. Now, that nobody bothered to check that a photograph was in fact from Buchenwald and not from Dachau is symptomatic of the broad irrelevance with which the Holocaust is met in Serbia. But what I also took from this exhibition was not only the indifference and carelessness when dealing with the Holocaust, but more fundamentally, the attempt to equate communism and fascism, and in doing so, appropriate Holocaust remembrance and imagery to delegitimize communism. But this is hardly an indigenous Serbian invention. In Hungary, here's the House of Terror, which goes out of its way to bring home the message that fascism and communism were flip sides of the same coin. There are multiple visual representations of black totalitarianism and red totalitarianism, of the black arrow cross, of the red star, of the fascist uniform and the communist uniform. And in addition to equating fascism and communism, and doing so with very blunt force, many of these museums and memorials have also begun depicting their entire nation states as victims of foreign regimes, completely ignoring both the actual lived experience of various victims of these regimes, but also completely erasing any discussion of local complicity for any historical crimes, be they crimes of the Holocaust or crimes of the Gulag. Similarly, the memorial to the victims of the German occupation that was erected in 2014 in Budapest memorializes Hungary, the country, as the main victim of the German occupation by a not very subtle depiction of Germany's imperial ego crushing of Hungary, which is symbolized by Archangel Gabriel. But note the deep domestic contestation this memorial has produced. The bottom of that picture are handwritten notes and photographs left by Holocaust survivors or their family members that want to tell the story of 430,000 Jews who were deported from Hungary, mostly to Auschwitz, the quickest rate of deportation in the history of the Holocaust, taking less than 2 months, and done with the active participation of Hungarian civil servants. And to the right is the picture in Vilnius, Lithuania, of the top tourist destination, which is the Museum of Victims of Genocide, but in a country that was ground zero for the Holocaust, where 95% of pre-war Jewish population was exterminated, which is the highest number of any occupied country anywhere in Europe. This is not the museum to those victims of that genocide. It is the museum to the victims of the Soviet occupation that in Lithuania is considered the real genocide. And yet, this remembrance of the 20th century is not exactly Holocaust denial. Viktor Orban even declared 2014 a year of Holocaust commemoration. However problematic, it does not prominently feature voices that deny the Holocaust as a historical fact, nor challenge its most established realities. It is also not quite the same as trivialization. While the emphasis always is on the larger ethnic groups, the Poles, the Hungarians, the Lithuanians suffering, it is relatively rare to hear outright belittling of Jewish victimization. So a more nuanced way of understanding this type of Holocaust remembrance I suggest in the book is as memory appropriation, where the memory of the Holocaust is used to memorialize a different kind of suffering, such as suffering under communism or suffering from ethnic violence perpetrated by other groups. It is Holocaust remembrance inward and away from the actual victims of the Holocaust or the Holocaust itself, and into what Eva Plonowska-Zjarek calls the narcissistic identification with Jewish suffering. So the principal argument in my book is that post-communist states today are dealing with conflicting sources of insecurity. They're anxious to be perceived as fully European by core Western European states, a status that remains fleeting. Being fully European, however, means sharing in the cosmopolitan European narratives of the 20th century, perhaps the strongest being the narrative of the Holocaust. But the European narrative of the Holocaust has created stress and resentment in post-communist states, which have been asked to accept and contribute to this primarily Western European account as members or candidate states of the European Union. The problem is that the cosmopolitan Holocaust memory as developed in the West simply does not narratively fit with a very different set of Holocaust memories in post-communist Europe. And this lack of fit is evident primarily in the lack of centrality of the Shoah as the defining memory of the 20th century experience across the post-communist space. As Tony Judd put it, quote, "The really uncomfortable truth about World War II was that what happened to the Jews was not nearly as important to most of the protagonists as later sensibilities might wish," end quote. Instead of the memory of the Holocaust, Eastern European states after communism constructed their national identities on the memory of Stalinism and Soviet occupation, as well as pre-communist ethnic conflict with other states. The European centrality of the Holocaust then replaced the centrality of communism and ethnic victimization as the dominant organizing narrative of post-communist states. And it is therefore threatening and destabilizing to these state identities. And so in this book, I document how influencing European Union's own memory policies and legislation in the process, post-communist states have attempted to resolve these insecurities by putting forward a new kind of Holocaust remembrance, where the memory, symbols, and imagery of the Holocaust become appropriated to represent crimes of communism instead. The criminal past is not fully denied, but the responsibility for it is misdirected. And this accomplishes two things. It absolves the nation from acknowledging responsibility for its criminal past, while at the same time, it makes communism as a political project criminal. But I want to make two additional important points. The centrality of the Holocaust as a foundational European narrative is also soundly rejected across post-communist Europe because of its perceived elevation of Jewish victimhood above victimhood of other regional majority ethnic groups, a move that is increasingly openly resented. In the absence of almost any Jews across vast swaths of the East, post-communist national identities were built first on a rejection of the communist pan-national identity project, where the organizing narrative is loyalty to the socialist and not the ethnic subject, but instead on ethnic majoritarian and therefore very homogeneous basis that leaves almost no room for incorporation of minority narratives. Holocaust remembrance, therefore, challenges the security of a nation's identity because it problematizes the very biography on which this identity was constructed. But further, the European Holocaust memory's focus on Jewish suffering is also rejected in much of post-communist Europe because it brings about discussion about extensive and deep local complicity in the Holocaust and material and political benefits of the complete Jewish absence across Eastern Europe. Jewish businesses, homes, and property have over decades of looting followed by communist seizures slowly morphed into the general economy with difficult and sporadic attempts at restitution. And the fact that post-World War II Jewish communities in these countries are negligible in numbers and have limited political clout is not incidental to this narrative. Once multicultural societies with large Jewish minorities are now mostly ethnically homogeneous. And this very fact of post-war ethnic homogeneity is a problem of cultural intimacy, an issue of domestic identity building, the thing that builds the nation together, but simultaneously an issue of international embarrassment and sometimes even shame. This is why much of Eastern Europe is a purposeful site of non-memory. It is a site of dismembered multi-ethnicity. Now, post-communist European states first encountered the European push for a unified cosmopolitan memory of the Holocaust as they tried to join various European organizations after 1991. Foremost in their applications for EU membership, but also membership in other European institutions, such as, for example, the Council of Europe. A major European institutional push was the Stockholm Forum on the Holocaust in January 2000, convened by Sweden to define a common framework for European Holocaust remembrance, research, and education. the forum established the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which remains the most explicit international organization that constructs, institutionalizes, and diffuses transnational Holocaust memory. And in 2005, the European Parliament adopted its most complete resolution on the Holocaust, which established January 27th, the day of liberation of Auschwitz in 1945, as the European Holocaust Memorial Day across whole of the EU. And while post-communist states accepted this new regulation, they signed documents, they adopted major parameters of the memory framework, not wanting to jeopardize the delicate process of EU accession. Once they were safely in the EU, the new Europeans demanded a thorough renegotiation of European memory politics, one that denies the Holocaust its centrality for post-war European memory, and instead places it on par with the other major totalitarianism of the 20th century, communism. And significantly, East European states forged alliances with the Western European right, most directly the European People's Party in the European Parliament, in pushing for EU resolutions and proclamations that would decentralize the Holocaust from pan-European memory and add crimes of Stalinism as its equal. And it is really the 2008 EU Prague Declaration that is perhaps the most explicit document that lays out the ideological framework post-communist European states have used regarding the place of the Holocaust in communist memory. And while the declaration's first article states that, quote, both the Nazi and communist totalitarian regimes should each be judged by their own terrible merits, end quote. The declaration then goes on to make this claim, quote, exterminating and deporting whole nations and groups of population were indivisible parts of the ideologies they availed themselves with, end quote, which explicitly equated the specifically genocidal aspect of Nazism, extermination of whole nations, and attributed it to communism. And this rhetorical move of referring to communist crimes instead of Stalinist crimes is critical here, as it implies that terror was communism's central organizing feature, which then makes it easily narratively equated with fascism. And indeed, this equation of the two regimes as being structurally the same even led one European member of parliament to declare, quote, I ask the European Parliament to stand in solidarity with the victims of fascist communism, end quote. And please also note that the official banner of the Prague Declaration movement wants to prohibit the hammer and the sickle, not the swastika. So let me finish by some concluding remarks. Why the Holocaust? Why now? The memory of the Holocaust has been debated and revisited and debated again. And so why does all this still matter? The principal point that I make in the book, and the one that I want to leave you with today, is that while the historical and moral importance of Holocaust remembrance should be self-evident, Holocaust remembrance is also important for global politics today. As the alarming turns to illiberalism in Poland, Hungary, and elsewhere show, joining the EU was not the end of history its architects imagined. And in fact, EU accession has allowed these states to embark on radical projects of historical inversion, which do tremendous violence to the historical record of World War II for very contemporary political purposes. So the question that motivated my book is simply, how did we get here? What explains the need of so many post-communist East European states to revisit the Holocaust now, 75 years later, and control the way in which the Holocaust is remembered, understood, and interpreted? And the argument that I make in the book is that these developments could best be understood as actions of profoundly, what I call ontologically insecure states. And I explore how states use their power, especially the power of memory, to undermine the very basis of that past. So practices of Holocaust remembrance that I describe in the book are important for contemporary politics today, because they indicate that the basis of nation building after communism was ethnic and exclusionary. And while this new identity may not be about the Jews or about the Holocaust at all, it comes from the place of exclusion of others, the non-existent Jews, but also the existing new others, refugees, migrants, or other ethnic minorities such as the Roma or Muslims. But most significantly and most globally, the great delegitimation of communism that has swept Europe since 1991 has also produced a de-delegitimation of fascism, which is repackaged, retold, and reinterpreted to look more palatable and polite in the 21st century. The great tragedy of the anti-communist moment is that it has weakened and made less imperative our collective anti-fascist moment, and we're now living the consequences. So in that sense, the Shoah is not only East European past, it also continues to be our present. Thank you very much. And I will now turn over to the commentators.
Well, thank you, Jelena, so much for this overview and putting so clearly the arguments, central arguments of the book. So I would like to hand over to Emil now to share his thoughts about the book. So Emil, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Florian. Good afternoon, evening, everyone. Thank you for coming, and thank you, Florian, for inviting me to this book panel. It's always a pleasure and an honor to speak about this book, so I'm a big fan. Before I start, I have to mention that my intervention today reflects my own personal views and does not represent the views of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. That's the standard thing we have to say before giving talks like this one. So anyway, I would like to make 3 general points about Yellow Star, Red Star. In the 3 central chapters of her book, Jelena analyzes what she refers to as the mnemonic battle for the interpretation of national history in Serbia, Croatia, and Lithuania, in which the suffering of the nation is recentered in the aftermath of a global geopolitical recomposition. The story of the genocide against the Jews, which during the roughly 40 years following the end of World War II, was controlled by the victorious communist regimes in Central and Eastern Europe, became, after their collapse, much more unsettling, explosive, and potentially dangerous for the new national reinterpretations of history than it ever was before. Jelena argues that rather than deny the Holocaust outright, these new nationalist narratives have engaged in slightly different, but generally qualitatively similar appropriations of Holocaust memory and even imagery, in order to emphasize the suffering of the nation under communism and reconstruct the nation as fundamentally anti-communist and thus, quote unquote, European. In this process, the Holocaust, as the genocide proper in this history, is necessarily marginalized, swept under the rug, paid lip service to, mentioned as a sad story, but not dealt with politically and legally. So my first set of observation has to do with the notion of ontological security or insecurity. Jelena develops this concept to make sense of the meanderings of the Holocaust memory in Eastern Europe. As political orders change fundamentally and disrupt the habitual institutions, relations, and other established intercourse of the international order, the argument goes, national narratives become unstable and states need to pin them down and institutionalize them in order to be able to reestablish ontological security and undergirding new national narrative that guarantees a normalized hegemonic understanding of the nation's past, present, and future. Now, as a historian, I have to admit that this notion initially sounded a little bit exotic to me, to be honest, but Jelena makes a convincing case that it works quite well for what it is trying to theorize. I think this lens provides a refreshing framework for studying the political implications of the dynamics of Holocaust memory and perhaps historical memory more generally. Or in other words, it is a great conceptual framework for comparative analysis, and that as a historian, I'm very much interested in. And so as soon as you get into this framework, you can ask broader questions of Holocaust memory and ontological security. And this book then goes, I think it has a potential to go beyond its Eastern European focus. What does it tell us, for example, that the permanent exhibit at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, an otherwise chronological exhibit, begins with the moment of American liberation of the camps in Germany? Ontological security or insecurity offers an interesting avenue for thinking about the American memory of the Holocaust, or even of World War II as a quote unquote, a good war, perhaps the one untarnished war in which the country was clearly one of the good guys and which it clearly won. It could be argued that the ontological anxieties in the United States are driven by the subsequent wars in which neither of these postulates, that we were the good guys and that we won, are obvious. And even beyond World War II and the Holocaust, historical memory in the United States is ripe for this kind of analysis and for comparison with other national contexts. Just think of the New York Times' 1619 project, which recently reframed the foundation of American history away from the War of Independence to the year 1619, when the year in which the first enslaved Africans were brought to the colony of Virginia. I think the notion of ontological insecurity is a great starting point for understanding the vitriolic political debate that this project has spawned in the United States. Then there is the question of Eastern Europe versus Europe. The book focuses on 3 relatively new countries in Europe and briefly examines in the concluding chapters several more formerly East European countries like Hungary, for example. But this is not the story, or only the story of Eastern Europe. The author, of course, knows that and says that herself. And one of the brilliant points in the book is the confident claim that there is a fateful dynamic between Western Europe's own unresolved memory knots and East European reinterpretations of history, exacerbated by the process of joining or the prospect of joining the European Union. This is all the more reason for comparison between the former East and the former West. I would love to see the case of Italy, for example, examined next to the case of Croatia, 2 countries with similarly strong both anti-fascist and fascist traditions. How will the European narrative of 2 totalitarianisms forged perhaps in Lithuania and Croatia, among others, play out in Italy? Will it completely delegitimize post-war Italian legacy of anti-Stalinist communism and redefine Italy as a fundamentally anti-communist European country? Jelena gestures towards these questions and implies, if I understand correctly, that the political landscape is not settled, that things can go both or even many different ways, and that it is a question of Europe, not just Eastern Europe. And how could it be otherwise? European societies are post-genocidal societies, and genocide has not even passed from living memory yet. The ontological insecurities brought about by the reconfigurations of 1989 catapulted this story back into political focus, playing out in different ways in different national contexts, depending on their interactions with other criminal pasts, such as, for example, colonialism. These are volatile issues Europeans would rather sweep under the rug. I'm thinking here of the Jewish Museum in Vilnius, which is neither called Jewish nor a museum, but is rather billed a tolerance center, all of which Jelena writes about in her book. For me, it is a metaphor for thinking of Europe in the throes of the 21st century pandemic of ontological insecurity, Europe as one giant multilingual tolerance center, where we don't engage the underlying issues of historical justice and truth-telling, where we don't explicate who is tolerated and by whom, but where it is clear that the limits of toleration stop at the point of recognition and solidarity with the other. Like, for example, the millions of people trying to flee carnage at home and find safety in Europe, the phenomenon which we euphemistically term the migration crisis. Finally, the third point or question I want to raise here is the question of Yugoslavia. This is admittedly a more narrow concern, but nevertheless, I think this book makes an important point, one not often made, about Yugoslavia's successor states. There is a tendency among scholars who work on Yugoslavia or the former Yugoslavia to claim uniqueness of their case. Yugoslavia is not like the rest of Eastern Europe. 1989 is meaningless as a metonym in Yugoslavia. Communism was different in Yugoslavia. But what this book does admirably, without bragging about it, I think, is show how unremarkable Yugoslavia was and how and post-Yugoslav space is. And how we benefit from understanding its successor states, not as a Yugoslavia problem that political science has to deal with, but a separate configuration fundamentally different from the rest of politics, but rather as an integral part of our debates on broad issues in politics. The historical trajectory of Yugoslavia thus transcends this view that it is somehow different, unique, in need of special explanation, and itself becomes a center for global political analysis. I think the recent series of brilliant articles under the heading Yugosplaining the World on the blog Disorder of Things, in which scholars of Yugoslavia, including Jelena, who was one of the conveners, addressed the questions of nationalism, institutional collapse, political violence, and other concepts, not from the Yugoslav exceptionalism, but from the central experience relevant for today's political configurations, not just in post-Yugoslav space, but in Europe or even in the United States. And I think this testifies to the power of that approach. I will stop here. I think this is a great book and a very important one. I look forward to Jelena's thoughts on these comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emil. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Jelena Đurenović, who will offer her thoughts and comments on the book. Jelena, the floor is yours.
Thank you. With a short introduction on the Second World War and the 20th century history in each of the studied countries and each of the chapters, including also the history of memory, this book can be considered and used as a handbook of memory politics in Eastern Europe, with, of course, wider implications than the case studies it covers. Jelena demonstrates how intertwined the dynamics of the Holocaust memory is with the memory of communism, how it becomes intertwined through memory appropriation and distortion of history that obscures the uniquely Jewish victimhood in the Holocaust, as well as the complicity of the domestic population in these countries in Eastern Europe in the Holocaust. The construction of memory of Stalinism, a term now used to represent all of communism in all its forms and regions, and serving as a counterpart to the Holocaust memory, is based on the Holocaust remembrance templates, tropes, narratives, and visuals. And this is visible in the book, but also if we look at it in practice, it is visible in different aspects of memory politics across the post-socialist space, including museums and exhibitions of victimhood under communism. The book is also a really brilliant account of the traveling of memory. The notion so dominant in memory studies over the last decade, however, usually associated with something positive, with cultural representations, cosmopolitan memory, and so on. So the memory of communism, well, the anti-communist memory of communism is not only something that belongs to Eastern Europe, and Jelena makes that clear throughout the book. It was constructed in the West too, especially if you look at some examples such as the Black Book of Communism and elevation of crimes of communism to the level of crimes of fascism became central to all projects of European memory, as evident in, for example, the House of European History. This anti-totalitarian memory travels from the post-socialist EU members and candidate countries to the EU institutions and then back as well, informing also the national memory cultures and memory politics, and also justifying these revisionist tendencies that are the topic of this book, that use the equalization of fascism and communism to actually condemn communism, while rehabilitating the defeated Second World War forces, very often perpetrators of the Holocaust as well. At the same time, the responsibility for the Holocaust is externalized in all these countries, as well as communism. It is externalized to the occupation forces, whitewashing the national history and constructing the nation as this permanent, eternal victim. The effect of this memory appropriation that Jelena analyzes in the Balkan and the Baltic states is erasing of the anti-fascist resistance and even criminalization of its fighters and veterans, especially if they were, as they often were, communists. And this contributes, as Jelena shows, and which is something I would really like to discuss more, to normalization of fascism in the present day. In Serbia, one of the case studies, and the case study that I also study, the Holocaust memory has been completely inverted into the emphasis on the victimhood of the Serbian nation. And it has even served the purpose of nationalist mobilization during the 90s, and it still does. And this is one of the points in the book that really kind of stayed with me. While there is a recognized commitment and involvement in the Holocaust remembrance at the international level, the very same actors who engage in this memorialization internationally appropriate the Holocaust memory to their own ends, and then at the same time the sites of extermination of the Jewish population of Serbia are misremembered as sites of exclusively Serbian suffering. For example, and I won't go into details here, the Serbian Orthodox Church pretends to be involved in the Holocaust remembrance at the national and international level, however, focuses mostly on the genocide against Serbs in Croatia during the Second World War. And then this institution of the Museum of Genocide Victims in Belgrade does pretty much the same, and then at the same time engaging in the genocide denial of Srebrenica genocide, for example. This book also shows some practical implications and consequences of the appropriation and distortion of the Holocaust memory and history, the problems with restitution, and the lack of willingness to really enable it fully. One of the perfect and horrible examples for it is Croatia, where the wartime independent state of Croatia is not recognized as a legal predecessor of today's Croatia, while socialist Yugoslavia is, meaning in practice that the victims of the Holocaust are not entitled to get restitution, while at the same time the descendants of the Ustasha, basically the perpetrators, can, if the communist regime took away their property in the post-war period. And here I will conclude. While I understand that the political consequences of Holocaust memory appropriation and rehabilitation of collaborators and Second World War fascist movements can be seen in the present-day rise of far-right and contemporary anti-Semitism, and that the causal factors determination is beyond the scope of this book, I am nevertheless both curious and worried about the dominance of right-wing populism in the international political setting at the moment, and the further implications this can have for memory politics, for Holocaust memory, historical justice, and also for memory of victims of mass human rights violations and genocide in general. The possibility of some kind of memory solidarity that Jelena talks at the very end of the book seems, for me, harder to imagine than ever. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jelena, for raising all of those points. I think both Emil and Jelena have raised a number of issues, maybe food for thought or ideas which came out of reading the book. So on one side, I would like to invite all of the participants to start thinking of questions. Please put them in the Q&A section, and I will address them to Jelena in due course. But before we do that, I would like to give you, Jelena, a chance to respond to some of the comments, some of the thoughts which come around. I mean, Emil was mentioning the kind of notion of how to bring in West or countries not in the post-communist field like Italy. And Jelena was asking a little bit more, I think, about also the implications for the contemporary in terms of the movements which have appropriated this and who are politically relevant. So these are just some of the key points which I think came out from the both comments, but feel free to pick up anything you might want to respond to.
Yeah, thank you very much both for really wonderful comments. I should say before I answer that both Emil and Jelena helped so much with the book. In fact, I think Emil has like a special do not reply on his email, considering how many emails I would send him to answer every single aspect of the book. I just want to like publicly acknowledge that Emil is the unsung hero of the book and provided me not only very, very detailed kind of contextual, historical understanding of the Holocaust, but also physically sent me materials from DC, from his institution that I used. And Jelena is my expert to call on the Chetnik movement and in general, kind of the Serbian World War II paramilitaries. And so she, again, probably has an auto reply to every single email I sent. So I just want to make sure that people understand that, you know, you cannot write a book on your own and you need a real team of friends and colleagues and people who have so much time to share with you and make the work better. So I just really want to say that. So I'm going to pick up on a couple of things. I think on the East-West issue, yes. So first of all, I make this clear in the book, but I need to make it clear as I present the book, is that I'm interested in Holocaust remembrance in Eastern Europe and patterns of remembrance over time. That is my research interest. That doesn't mean that I don't think that there are patterns of problematic Holocaust memorialization and remembrance in the West. Quite the contrary. This is, you know, I can only go with my strength. So I leave it to many other more qualified people to talk about Holocaust remembrance in the West. I will say I have an article coming out where I do try to correct for this, I guess, missing piece in the book, where I do compare some of the patterns of contemporary Holocaust remembrance in the East and the West, and actually talk specifically about this remembrance dialogue. So in that article, which is being prepared for a special issue in the journal Holocaust Studies, in that article, I talk about how in many ways the problems and revisionism in the East gives cover to the West. And now, you know, Belgium and France and Italy, a very problematic case, can point to Poland and Hungary and say, well, deal with them, we're doing fine. Well, in fact, they're not doing fine. And there are a lot of tensions in the West, even in countries that we don't, you know, usually think about, like Belgium and the Netherlands, where there's such a dominant narrative of resistance and heroism that it covers the real problems of very mass complicity or apathy by the citizens of those countries during World War II. I think Italy is very important, and it plays out a little bit with the case of Yugoslavia, because as you know, Emil, of course, 10 times better than I do, the memory of Nazi and fascist oppression in Yugoslavia was different based on whether it was German occupation or Italian occupation. So again, the brutality of the Germans has given Italians a lot of cover to say, well, if you were under Italian occupation, things were much better for you, which again then forecloses some of the real discussion about the responsibility of the Italian fascist regime. Not to mention the very strong mythology in Italy that, you know, Italy saved its Jews. Well, not so much the Jews who came from elsewhere. And again, that's the same narrative that you hear in many other countries in the West. We saved our Jews, we just didn't save any of the refugee Jews who came from Poland and elsewhere. So this is just a very long answer to kind of tell you to give me a little bit of time to have this manuscript finished, where I try to talk about the dialogue in memory between East and West. I really appreciate your comment about the non-uniqueness of Yugoslavia. I think that's really wonderful, because you're completely right. Most of my career, I have to tell people Yugoslavia was different. And when you talk about communism, remember us, our communism was different. And we were not behind the Iron Curtain. And, you know, you can spend so much time fighting that battle that then you you ignore the fact that so many of the patterns of both the Holocaust and World War II and post-World War II remembrance really flow within the narrative arc of the 20th century. In fact, and this gets to, there was a question in the Q&A that now I can answer because it relates to this. How did I choose my cases and what was the reason why I chose Yugoslavia? Part of, and Emil mentioned this, one of my real motivations was to place the history of Yugoslavia within the narrative arc of the Holocaust and show how it's actually central to the escalation of the Holocaust. It's not just something that happened in the Balkans, and we all know about the Holocaust in Poland or the Holocaust in Hungary, but nobody really cares about what happened in the Balkans. I wanted to bring the Holocaust in the Balkans and then the communist remembrance of the Holocaust in the Balkans really centrally to the story of the 20th century, because as I describe in great length in my, especially the chapter on Serbia, some of the practices that Germans first tried of mass gassing and extermination all happened in Serbia. Serbia was actually very important for the technology of death, which was then transported into many other places in the East. So I think that putting Yugoslavia back in is very critical. And then finally, just a couple of things to Jelena's comments on the contemporary appropriation of the Holocaust for global politics and for political battles of today. Again, her own work speaks to this very well, but what we are seeing in Serbia, but in Croatia and in many countries of the region is that there's a complete reversal of the narrative of what happened in World War II. So in Serbian history books of today for 8th grade history, it's very, very common to read phrases like in World War II, there were two groups who fought. They're Germans. They were anti-fascists on the left, they were the partisans, and anti-fascists from the right, who were the Chetnik paramilitaries. And it's historically inaccurate in every sense of the word, but it also is very politically important for normalizing that pattern in Serbian political history, where there's a kind of artificial reconciliation between the right wing and the left wing, so that they can be also politically conciliated in the present. So in that sense, this is real use of the past for very, very contemporary political purposes, including political party competition of today.
Great. Thanks a lot. We have a lot of wonderful questions. The way it works is I will select some questions, try to group them together so that we have a good flow. So if you put a question, I don't get to pose it to Jelena. Jelena can pick up on it as well, of course, but I want to make sure to kind of get a flow going as much as possible. So I want to take two questions, Jelena, to ask you first. Carol Lilly asked about how the Jewish community within the post-Yugoslav space or post-socialist countries respond to this, being quite small. And then Sven Milikic asks about the response of Israel to this particular kind of appropriation. So both from within and from without, how is this kind of equalization of the two totalitarianisms perceived?
And again, Sven, another unsung hero. I'm so happy that Sven had the time to listen to this. I publicly want to thank Sven. Really, without Sven, no Croatia chapter completely would have existed. Really, so much help and so much support. So thank you very much. These questions are in my mind connected. The question about the contemporary Jewish response and the role of Israel, and they're connected in a way that I find very, very problematic and very upsetting. And that is simply to say that Jewish communities in Eastern Europe are very small, they're marginal, and they are under threat. And they're under threat increasingly, and especially in places like Hungary, but elsewhere as well. Poland, I don't think is far behind. And they're under threat in terms of anything from kind of discursive attacks in the press to a very steep rise in anti-Semitic language at the high seats of power from leaders of countries. But the problem is, and this is where the role of Israel is so difficult to measure, is that from the perspective of Israel, the position of these Jewish minorities is irrelevant. only what matters from the position of Israel is that the governments of these countries are allies of Israel in its foreign policy. So to be very blunt, it doesn't matter to Bibi Netanyahu if Viktor Orban is abusing local Jewish communities, as long as Viktor Orban is going to vote against Palestinian statehood in the UN Security Council. This is we live in very, very strange times where I have said this before and gotten a lot of pushback for it, but I do feel that we live in a very strange time where the positions and the public statements and policies of Israeli governments are actually making diaspora Jews less safe and not more safe. And I feel that very strongly also in relationship to American Jewish community and the role that Israel played, for example, after the Pittsburgh pogrom a couple of years ago. I think there's a decoupling between the interests of political interests and foreign policy interests of Israel and what that then does to the safety, but also viability of a strong Jewish diaspora life, especially in countries that are really not historically have been hospitable to Jewish life. So I think it's a very, very unfortunate moment in time. There's also, with that marginalization comes, there's an economic marginalization. There's a lot of increasing anti-Semitism as there are restitution laws that are passed. So even in places that were not traditionally anti-Semitic, now there's restitution. Now Jewish communities get property. Now the anti-Semitism is on the rise. So it's a very, very tough place, I would say.
Thanks. We have a couple of questions. I want to ask you, kind of group them in three, maybe. One is by Irina Livesiano about the choice. Why did you pick Lithuania? I think this has come up in, because of course Serbia, Croatia is an obvious choice considering your previous research. Lithuania is the odd one out, so to speak. So how did you end up with Lithuania? There's another question which came up, which was about, Lynn Tessa asked about how do you see the parallels between your hijack justice argument and your current book? And again, you have a similar way in which countries, post-Yugoslav countries are negotiating the demands of how to commemorate the past from the outside, right? And they're kind of renegotiating external pressures and trying to, in a sort of way, use their domestic narratives to reshape external demands. So I'm just kind of curious to hear, or the question is about those links. And then we also have a question, which I want to just put there, by Peter Pollack Springer, which also I think is an important one. To which degree was there really a break between the communist period and the post-communist period? He's asking, to which degree this is the case, because in Poland, the communists would also use the Auschwitz Museum more as a metaphor of Polish suffering than of Jewish suffering. So what is your take on that? Okay.
So why did I choose Lithuania and why did I choose any of these cases? So I will say, so the three cases that I study in depth are Serbia, Croatia, and Lithuania, but the book then goes on and I have a concluding chapter where I do briefer kind of mini case studies. So in those, I talk about Slovakia, I talk about Ukraine, and I talk about Russia. And in my introduction, I talk in more general terms about Poland and Hungary. So I cover slightly more ground than just these two cases. But from a kind of, if you want a social scientific research design, what I was driven by is an attempt to find cases that would be different on their historical experience of the Holocaust, on the size of the Jewish community, on the experience of communism, and then see what is it that in the end they have that's similar. So in some ways I wanted to find, the experience of Yugoslavia and the experience of the Baltics is as extremely different as you possibly can within the universe of communist cases. And so what I developed in the book is kind of a typology of memory politics, where I talk about my overarching argument that I presented is about memory appropriation. But within that, I have a typology of what that really means and how it's different in different cases. So I talk about three main types of memory appropriation: memory inversion, which I talked about in the Serbian case, as we just discussed, where the Holocaust now represents the suffering under communism. And I call that memory inversion. In the Croatian case, I talk about memory divergence, where I talk about, and again, this is in many ways influenced by what Sven Milikic and others in Croatia have written about way before me, which is this divergence between the memory of World War II more broadly and the memory of the Holocaust specifically. And so there's more likelihood that the Holocaust is remembered in Croatia than, for example, the genocide against the Serbs, even though they were done at the same time in same camps and by same groups. But politically, it's easier to talk about crimes against the Jews because that responsibility can be taken, deflected onto the Germans. And, you know, Germans made us do it, but you cannot really say that about the Croatian genocide against the Serbs because Germans did not make the Croatians to do it. So that type of appropriation I call memory divergence. There's simply a divergent way in which the same types of events were remembered. And then in the Lithuanian case, there's some similarity with the Baltics, a little bit with Latvia, less so with Estonia, simply because the Jewish population in Estonia was so small. And Jewish population in Lithuania was large. And as I mentioned in my introductory talk, Lithuania was the most deadly place to be a Jew in World War II. 95% of all Lithuanian Jews and Jews who fled into Lithuania from Poland were killed. In that case, I talk more about memory conflation, where there's now, where the Soviet occupation and the period of the Holocaust are all presented as one long era where, you know, you put like the names of the victims together, you tally the numbers, and there's very little differentiation between the victims of one genocide versus what in Lithuania they would call the Soviet genocide. So I wanted to point to these quite different ways of memory in different countries, and Lithuania was an excellent candidate for the type of memory conflation I was interested in. Also, I feel also that Lithuania is understudied. We kind of know that bad things happen with Lithuania, but I really wanted to present how bad Lithuania was. It's similarly how I wanted to bring Yugoslavia back in. I wanted to bring some of the edges of Eastern Europe back in and really present that case as deeply problematic. Okay, so the second question was, how is this argument similar to my first book? Well, you know, it's interesting. As I was writing my first book, you know, more than 10 years ago, the World War II kept coming back. You really, as all of us know, everybody who's on this call, I'm sure knows, there's really no understanding the wars of the 1990s. They don't make sense if you don't hear what people are saying. And a lot of times people will go back to World War II. And so that the legacy of World War II was obvious as I was writing that book. But there was also, it was clear to me when I finished my first book that there's, it's not just the political institutions that are important, it's also the political memory and how memory of really, you know, events 80 years ago directly impact contemporary politics. And so that is a lesson that I've taken, if you will, from my first research into this book. I also was struck as I was writing my first book and started to think about it, how little, in fact, the Holocaust featured in people's memory. It was all about World War II, it was all about partisans and Chetniks, and a little bit about the Ustasha, and really the important story of the almost complete annihilation of these Jewish communities was missing. And so part of my motivation was to bring that absence back. And if you can, there was a third question about the break with communism, and I think I missed.
It was about the kind of continuities, whether or not the post-communist memory, which put the nation in front of the memory of the Jewish suffering, is really that much of a break, or rather continuity to the communist period.
Yes. Oh yeah, that's great. Yeah. So this is why I spend a huge amount of time in the book talking about the communist period. So each of the three main chapters deals with, it's kind of broken down into the history of the Holocaust and how the Holocaust played out, and then how it was remembered during communism, and then what elements of that communist memory then continue into the present day. And the question is completely correct. I mean, the person who wrote the question is correct. There are there clear connections in really not remembering the Holocaust as a event on its own terms, a part of but separate from World War II, either during communism or after. And in many ways, this is the point that I was trying to make, is that the Holocaust was not remembered during communism, but not after. And it's because of an ideological commitment under communism to really flatten ethnic diversity and talk about the socialist subject and how our ethnicity and our ethnic minorities don't matter. It's about the future and the kind of socialist rebuilding. But I think the same pattern, just with a different content, plays out today, where again, what is flattened is ethnic diversity. And there's contemporary nation building and post-communist nation building is predicated on real ethnic homogeneity. And that's kind of the rebirth of the nation after communism was on very non-diverse and very homogeneous grounds. But yes, to the extent that we can talk about why Holocaust remembrance in Eastern Europe is really different than in the West, it is the presence of communism and the long period of communist interpretation of the past that has continuing legacies into today.
Thanks. I want to first apologize to the people asking questions. There are 30 open questions and there's no possible way we can manage to get Jelena to answer all of them. And we also don't want to rush her because again, it's supposed to be a conversation and a chance to develop some of them. I will ask you two, I grouped together. Myra Waterbury asks this about whether or not there were missed opportunities in the way the European Union has been in a certain way engaging with the region. So to which degree in a certain way, it's the role of the external actor, which has been maybe promoting a particular view or not being sensitive enough. I mean, also to this anxiety you've mentioned, because if the cause is the sense of ontological anxiety or insecurity, then how could that insecurity maybe have been addressed by it? And I think that's also dovetails nicely with Brigitte Lenormand's question about to which degree are they, she says, are they just piggybacking on narratives made available to them by external actors, such as the European Union? So to which degree they are in a certain way opportunistically using these available narratives, which has been sometimes described as European memory framework, by Anna Milosevic, for example, and others. So how, it's not about the guilt of the European Union, but rather about the relevance of the external actors in creating the circumstances where these narratives could emerge.
Yeah, great question. So the first question is really, it's really a key question, the question about missed opportunities, or another way of putting it, what could have been done better, or what could we do better? And that is the key question to which I don't have a particularly good answer. I have some thoughts. I think we, in some ways, leave, this relates to the second question, we leave EU and Europe a little bit off the hook here by presenting this East European space after the end of communism as this like tabula rasa, and these Europeans are going to come and they're going to tell us how we should do things and how we should do it appropriately. And I've read many of these very early kind of white papers and policy presentations by various European actors, and they are so condescending and so kind of colonial in their approach towards Eastern Europe. I have a couple of quotes about this in the book where they talk about how Eastern Europe is very backward when it comes to its remembrance. Its memory is very primitive and naive. And, you can debate this one way or the other, but that is just certainly not an approach if you want to have partners. So there was a very kind of Orientalist view of Eastern Europe with all those consultants, coming in and setting things up in a way that they were supposed to be appropriate. So there's just an issue of approach. But I think a more fundamental problem is that I think we forget, or maybe we don't, how at the end of communism, how everybody thought that communism was over. It was, I'm old enough to remember that this was supposed to be the end of history. Communism is over. Liberal democracy is victorious. Communism as a project is defeated. And there was an unbelievably naive expectation that everybody will see it the same way. Nobody will want to have communism back. There's nothing good that can be saved from communism. There's nothing good that communism has ever done. And so this was just part of this project of a very, very strong ideological anti-communism that emanated from the West, not just in the East. And so there was really no attempt to figure out, well, there was something in this political narrative that can be preserved. There was something about the way in which World War II was understood, the way in which anti-fascism was understood. There was something about maybe not lifting up ethnic identity under communism, but projecting a more multicultural universe that could be preserved. I mean, there's some things that were more complex, but all of that was really destroyed at the end of communism, and everything was thrown out. And I think that was neither, I think, normatively a good thing, because I do think that there are some things that could have been preserved from kind of a values point of view, but also I don't think it was strategically good, because it created a tremendous sense of resentment and a real feeling of being colonized by this Western memory project. And the participant who asked the question was also correct in the second part, which is that there was no attempt to think of the sensibilities that, for example, especially in countries of the former Soviet Union, the long legacy of Soviet terror and the memories and the unacknowledged memories of that terror, how that would play out with memories of communism. That didn't really play into a lot of these somewhat misguided attempts to present a unified narrative. So I think that the role of the EU is critical here. I really think that it's critical in two ways. In a very mechanical way is that a lot of these countries, as they were getting into the EU, knew that they had to do something. And EU was very mechanical in asking for specific boxes to be checked. So, you know, you get a form, have you done this? Have you done that? And so they would so a lot of these very important processes were kind of little checks on the box, which is how the EU likes it. EU is an incredibly bureaucratic organization, much more interested in really checking some of the boxes than in fundamental transformation. But also in its own view of the past. I talk in the book a lot about the contemporary European memory of World War II and how that's changing. And I talk, for example, about the House of History in Brussels, which is a very problematic institution in many ways. I mean, it suffers from some of the similar problems as some of the other institutions of memory we talked about in Eastern Europe, where the European idea is presented as one in a kind of teleological manner. There's no comparison. Of course, everybody wants to be European, and of course, everybody wants to join the EU. And the EU is kind of this, culmination of progress of humanity. And there's very little discussion of some real problems in the European project, including legacies of colonialism that a lot of these core European countries are not really willing to seriously deal with.
Yeah, I think we have maybe space for a couple of questions to conclude with, and then I also would like to give a chance to Emil and Jelena to see if they also want to add something to the last round before we wrap up. And I mean, one of the points is it came up in a couple of questions. One was about, how does civil society see these discourses? Because of course, what you're talking about is mostly the perspective of the state, and this also kind of connects to another question which asks about, how much do citizens actually know about this, or that rather it's not taught very much. So the kind of lack of knowledge seems to be another problem, which one of the questions was asking about. So it's in a certain way more the kind of bottom-up perspective, while of course your story is much about the state narratives about the past. So how do you see this in a certain way, the bottom-up lens? And this also goes to another question, which is about how these people are socialized also in these narratives. I mean, they then take a life of their own. So if you could maybe reflect on that and use this also as a kind of concluding round, and I would like to then give the floor to Jelena and Emil as well to add.
Right. So very briefly, these two things are absolutely connected. So I do talk. You're right. My interest is in official narratives, because what I'm interested in is if you are a high school student and you have to go on a school organized trip to a museum, they're going to take you to the official museum. They're not going to take you to some NGO that is trying their best. So I'm interested in main official, what I call hegemonic narratives that become so prevalent that they end up being taught in textbooks. And so that's what I'm interested in. I'm not, because they have more power and they have more reach because the state has more reach than the civil society. However, in all the countries that I analyze, I talk about the efforts of small groups. Some are efforts by Jewish groups, but not only, many efforts by human rights groups, many efforts by cultural groups, many efforts by, there's in some countries by kind of separate teacher groups that are printing supplementary textbooks, specifically on the issue of sensitive topics such as World War II or the Holocaust, and are trying to teach separately or in addition to what their government mandated to do. And there are, especially in the realm, I would say, of art and culture, quite a vibrant opposition to some of these narratives. And I talk about them all over from Serbia, Croatia, and certainly in Lithuania, a very strong kind of counter movement to this. But I think we sometimes lull ourselves by saying, well, it's not that bad because there's this NGO that's doing really good work. And the NGO is doing fantastic work. It's just that it's often very, very marginalized. It doesn't penetrate the media and popular culture to the extent that official state museums, memorials, and monuments do.
Great, thanks. Jelena, Emil, would you like to have a last comment, observation, some of the discussions we've had before we close?
I would maybe just add something to this topic of the civil society, because this is what I was mostly in my research interested in illiberal civil society. That also thinks that these states are not doing enough when it comes to dealing with the communist past, and that they are not enough revisionists, and they're not investing enough efforts in this. So there are different groups as well that exist within this civil society. And what I found, and this will be my last comment actually, what I found it really most interesting was this uncritical acceptance of the EU as the carrier of cosmopolitan liberal memory. And so in the case of Serbia, for example, when it comes to rehabilitation of the Chetniks or other defeated Second World War forces and collaborators, there were many civil society initiatives that wrote open letters to the EU institutions, to embassies and so on, thinking that rehabilitation of these people will endanger Serbia's EU accession, which I found really, really one of the most, the biggest paradoxes of it, that still there are different, some are critical to the state efforts, that they're not enough. Some think that the EU will come and save us from historical revisionism. So, and of course, there are many more other groups and levels and so on, but I will just finish here.
Great, thanks a lot, Jelena. Emil, for lesson.
I would like to just thank Maria Vulesica, who made this point about how the kind of space for contestation and kind of memory battles could be kind of removed by better education and by people knowing about the actual facts and what happened during the Holocaust. And it's true, she pointed out that vast majorities in Serbia and Croatia really don't know the basic facts about what actually happened during the Holocaust. I remember years ago, there was a public poll of the Serbian population about what happened to the Jews in Serbia during the Holocaust, and the majority of the people who responded believed that most Jews in Serbia were saved because the Serbs are these generous people who are historical friends with the Jews. All these like lines of propaganda that came from the regime. But I think, while I see the point of this, I also kind of think that this is partly also the kind of the question of the chicken and the egg. I think the fact that most people don't know much about the Holocaust in the former Yugoslavia reflects the other irrelevance and kind of disinterest in the fate of others or you know, people who are constructed as others in these societies. And I think Jelena's beginning, the example from the beginning, where, you know, this fiasco about Sajmište Buchenwald Dachau photograph, I think is the paradigm of this kind of, you know, who cares what camp this is? Who, you know, who cares who these victims in the picture are? The point is that, you know, Serbs suffered here from the communist, you know, were persecuted here by the communist regime. So once this is a political objective, then, you know, education is not something you want to pursue.
Great, thanks a lot, Emma. And of course, we should mention that Emma is involved in a lot of actually research and bringing research to educational institutions. So he's actually working on that a lot. But time is up, unfortunately. We could discuss for many more hours, but we have to stop here. There will be other panels, presumably with Jelena presenting her book, so you can ask her the questions in the future. But I would like to thank Jelena for discussing her book with us today. So it's a, you know, really highly recommended and worth reading. And I'd also like to thank Emil and Jelena for finding the time and discussing the book with us today. I want to just make a few concluding announcements. First of all, the virtual ASN continues. We're going to have the next event on the 5th of November called The Day After, Russian-European Relations in the Wake of US Presidential Elections. This should be quite an interesting debate. It will be moderated by Alexandra Cooley, who's the director of the Harriman Institute, Columbia University, a longstanding partner of the ASN, and of course the host of the conventions over the years. And then also, I would like to thank the people who you might not see during the virtual ASN, but who are extremely important for making all of this work. We have Lisa Koryuchkina, who is our ASN communications officer, who is really important in getting all of this sorted and worked and making sure that we can all have this event. And Lucine Poturian, who is our virtual ASN managing assistant, who is also helping with arranging everything. And of course, Zsuzsa Cergo, who you've seen, who is the director of the virtual ASN. And you will see lots more events in the coming months and years. And of course, we'll also have the virtual ASN convention next year. We will not be able to meet in New York, but we'll have many panels also on the topics we've been discussing today virtually and all over the world in next spring, and then in 2 years, hopefully live again from New York. So thank you all. Thanks, Jelena, for joining us. Thanks all of you, and hope to see you again soon.